Don't you just want to have a wedding feast after that? The beginning of a new year is customarily a time when we are encouraged to look boldly towards the future, making resolutions about how we will move into it. But I'd like to encourage all of us to ease into 2025. It's going to be a difficult year. So let's ease into it by taking stock of the past year. Indeed, all the years that came before it, the ones we can remember, in order to more clearly discern the trajectory of our lives, while imagining the possibilities of the time that is still to unfold for us, without succumbing to fear or despair. We have always faced challenges, sometimes grave ones, and we must recall the past clearly, not sentimentally, if we are to prepare ourselves for the year ahead and the years after that. Do you recall Y2K, also known as the millennial bug, when some imagined that our technology would grind to a halt because of a coding limitation when computers first came into service? A limitation that programmed computers and computer-based devices for years and decades, but not for centuries and millennia. Or so we thought. Some wondered how they would behave when their internal calendars turned over from one century to the next. It didn't help to calm anxieties that the particular change in centuries was also a change of millennia, with all the superstition associated with that. So some people behaved as superstitiously as people on the eve of the second millennium, not the third. A year before our computer odometers rolled over, Daniel Shore, senior news analyst for National Public Radio, suggested that the real Y2K threat was less a computer problem than it was the people problem that occasionally bubbles to the surface. We should be concerned, he said at the time, about the millennialists and survival groups that have fixated on the advent of the year with 3 zeros as a time for the apocalypse, Armageddon, doomsday, the end of the world as we know it. Shore forgot to mention the rapture. In the end, it proved to be the non-event of the century, quite literally. We could say the non-event of the millennium if we wanted to be grandiose. But here we are, a quarter of a century later. Yes, it's been that long. A quarter of a century later, quite literally, still saddled with the assortment of kooks who waited with glee for the end of the world, or at least civilization. And they've had 25 years, a whole generation, as we reckon the generations, to orchestrate a dystopian future to redeem their unrealized apocalypse, hoping to at least intimidate the rest of us if they cannot realize their dream, or should I say nightmare. Soon after Y2K passed, without serious incident, a new calendar-based distraction emerged when misinterpretations of the so-called Mayan calendar, or more precisely the Mesoamerican long count calendar, led to a new wave of Chicken Littles proclaiming that something cataclysmic awaited us on December 21st, 2012, when the calendar was going to run out. It was inconvenient that this date landed on the winter solstice, particularly for those of us who enjoy celebrating the solstice as well, the most inclusive of the midwinter festivals. But December 21st it was. As they described it, intimating that the ancient Mayans knew something that we didn't about the end of time. Now, as some of us dig out our Bibles to take a peek at the book of Revelations and start to have a little wondering of our own right now when we look at current events, we do well to remember that this pattern of imagining that the end is nigh is an age-old fear. It recurs again and again and again. And there has never been a generation without people in hairy shirts or prophetic robes out carrying signs proclaiming that the end is nigh, that time is about to expire like an old loaf of bread or a jug of milk. But nothing happened on December 21st, 2012 either. In some ways, the presumed problem was similar to Y2K, and like that earlier problem, the anxiety proved baseless. Or did it? Yes, it did. Nothing happened. I'm just joshing with you. The calendar, one of our principal tools in measuring time, as important to us as the years pass and the clock to us as the hours pass, has a curious effect upon us that extends far beyond its practical purpose. Calendars, and our Gregorian calendar, is only one of the countless ways that humans have devised to measure the months, years, and centuries. Calendars affect us almost mystically at times. There's a magic to them, particularly for those who may not see the magical technology that we play with today. But there's something akin to magic in a calendar, in a clock, in a sextant, or any of the other tools that we may use to navigate our way through life. They invest particular days with greater meaning than others. They establish the basis for birthdays and anniversaries and those recurring celebrations we call holidays, a contraction for holy days. They provide milestones for registering the events of the human journey. They allow us to mark the cycles of the seasons with precision. They provide us with the means to differentiate long lives from short ones, and their very measures generate both reassurance and anxiety. Like any form of measurement, the calendar doesn't simply measure things, it also serves to shape our reality. We are a people of the calendar, writes David Ewing Duncan, adding that our obsession with measuring time is itself timeless, while suggesting that this may be the most distinctive trait of human beings after self-awareness, both of which are related to our consciousness of our own mortality. I think this is true for myself. My life has been governed by calendars for as long as I can remember, even before I really needed calendars. I have a magnificent collection. You see, I don't get rid of things, which is something that could be turned into a reality television show if I wanted to earn the big money. But I hold on to things. And in addition to my substantial library and my very large music collection and all of my children's childhood drawings from daycare and school, and my father's tax returns from 1950 until he died in 1978, and every ornament that has ever been given to me or that I have picked up as a souvenir, In addition to these things, I have in my study every calendar I've ever owned. It's quite a collection because I have never owned just one calendar. And even though for the better part of 15 or 20 years, I have mostly used the calendar on my computer, I have always kept a paper calendar in addition because I'm, mildly paranoid about losing my digital calendar, which is in fact grounded in reality, since I have lost my digital calendar at least 3 times through computer crashes. And so I keep a backup. And it varies between being a real document to tell me where I ought to be at any given time, and actually being more of a record of where I have been, as well as a document that I can use to imagine where I want to be. So I use calendars as planning devices in my life. I even identified the perfect calendar to use for my purposes, which I will not reveal to you because I don't do paid or unpaid advertisements from the pulpit. But I found a calendar that worked for me, just as I found the perfect satchel to carry my computer in and the perfect luggage to take on the road, because these things have been important to me. The nature of my work was always such that I needed to keep a calendar. That is, once I started working. Before then, I didn't really have need of a calendar at all, but that didn't prevent me from having one. So when my life was simple enough that I knew that on Monday mornings I had to get up and head to math class at high school, or more precisely, skip math class in order to hang out with the woman who became my wife because she had a spare period, having been a better planner at organizing her day. Every Monday I knew I was supposed to be in math, whether or not I was there. On Wednesdays I knew I was supposed to be in geography. On Sundays I knew I was skipping church. And on Saturdays by high school, I usually had to work that day. My calendar was simple and I didn't need to record it, but I did, because there's something wrong with me. And it emerged as a fact very early on. By the time I was in business, though, the calendar came in real handy because I could jot down notes about things that I had to do. When I was a purchasing agent, about items I needed to purchase. And I still have it, even though I haven't purchased commercially for 42 years. And there is something, just something about the appearance of a calendar, which, well created, even in its simplest forms, is in fact a work of art and not just a tool. And so I've always had more than one. My digital calendar that I use now, and the paper calendar where I record it. And then, of course, the calendars that I buy because they're beautiful, because they have beautiful pictures of beautiful places in the world, from Iceland to Prince Edward Island, and even here in Manitoba. Or because my grocer or an undertaker has given the calendar to me, and I kind of feel obliged to at least keep it as a backup in case my paper calendar fails after my digital calendar disappears from my computer. So I have calendars everywhere, and I love them. I have come to the conclusion that the calendar was one of the most brilliant inventions in human history. We talk about the wheel. We talk about the airplane. We talk about the computer. But I bet all of you can imagine living without those things, perhaps living difficultly, but living without them. I can't imagine ordering my life without a calendar. Duncan opens his comprehensive exploration of the calendar, which he published on the eve of the millennium, with a story of a visit to a physician who was dying in the hospital. He was a distressingly emaciated figure, writes Duncan, his face a mask of skin over his skull, his hands a pale shade of purple from weeks of intravenous needles. Yet his voice remained deep and powerful, his eyes lively. When a friend asked how long he was going to be in the hospital this time, the surgeon said he didn't know, that time was becoming irrelevant to him. It's ironic, he said, smiling weakly. I lived by the calendar for 60 years. Beepers, schedules, these things ruled my life. Now I have no idea what day it is, and this doesn't bother me. It's as if I'm floating, he said. Reflecting on his own busy day, the various tasks and meetings that awaited him after he left the hospital, Duncan confessed that he envied the doctor in a way, because he had reached the stage of life when his remaining days were no longer governed by the calendar. The doctor was floating, while Duncan was still anchored to his schedule, bound by it. This is our blessing and our curse, he said, to count the days and weeks and years, to calculate the movements of the sun, moon, and stars, and to capture them all in a grid of small squares that speed out like a net cast over time. Thousands of little squares for each lifetime. I loved how Duncan talked about the geometry of how we measure time, about the circular nature of the clock and the square nature of the calendar. If we were Trinitarians, we would probably find a way to demonstrate the triangular nature of time and somehow tie it to the three persons of the Trinity. But it is interesting the different ways we organize our time based on the length of time we have or don't. It's interesting to me how this surgeon reached the stage where he was living almost in eternity on a day-by-day basis, no longer concerned about moving from one square to the next, not even concerned about watching the hands on the clock. Time was an eternal now in the last days of that surgeon's life. And time is an eternal now for small children, for whom a single day, a single hour, a single 5-minute time out feels like an eternity. Now I wake up one year having wondered where the previous year went, but I remember as a child how long, how excruciatingly long small segments of time could be. I have another kind of calendar in my home, though, beyond the kind with squares in it. This calendar I have, or these calendars, occupy books, whole volumes, with single pages and more devoted to particular days. You see, among other things, among other curious habits I have, when I wake up in the morning and I sit down at my computer and ignore my email, the first thing I do is I click on the day in Wikipedia. Now, This wasn't always a Wikipedia task because the Free Press used to do this for me by publishing the big events of history on a particular day in the paper, something they no longer do. But I sit down, I go to Wikipedia, and I check to see what happened on this day in the past. For instance, a quick check of Wikipedia today reveals that the political philosopher Edmund Burke, botanist Priscilla Susan Bury, Indian philosopher Swami Vivekananda, author Jack London, and journalist Christiane Amanpour were all born on this day in years past, while novelist Agatha Christie breathed her last on this day. As it turns out, January 12th isn't a particularly good day for big events in world history, but there are days that stick in our minds. 9/11, December 7th, July the 1st, January the 1st, December 25th, which we associate with turning points in world history. And they come immediately to mind. Well, because I love to know what happens on particular days, and because I organize my life by the calendar, even though I am chronically late and forget things more often than I care to admit, I have also organized my reading around the calendar. Some people pick a book off the shelf and read it from cover to cover. Other people dip into magazines. I have a collection of what are called commonplace books that I read on an almost daily basis. Not all 50 of them, I don't have the time, but that's how large the collection became. About 40 years have passed since I acquired my first commonplace book, which is the name given to a volume where maxims and proverbs, poems and prayers, notes and quotations are gathered together in a common place. In their most basic form, they may resemble scrapbooks, particularly the ones that people have assembled for themselves, while more sophisticated ones are essentially anthologies of writings that may be inspiring or practical, oftentimes both. People have been keeping commonplace books for as long as pens and paper have been around, and with the advent of the printing press, it was inevitable that some people would publish the contents of theirs to share with a wider audience. While a few commonplace books are organized by subject matter or literary genre, the most common and my favorite ones are organized by the calendar. They contain entries for each month or day of the year. The first commonplace book I acquired was a book of daily strength, which was edited by Reverend Valentine D. Davis and published by the American Unitarian Association about 120 years ago, although I acquired it a few years later. Not long afterward, I picked up a reprint copy of Daily Strength for Daily Needs, compiled by Mary Tilliston, which was originally published around the same time as Davis's volume. In fact, a disproportionate number of commonplace books have been compiled by women. And although that doesn't mean that they have as much writing by women within them as I would like, they are nevertheless valuable because they contain the things that men have written that didn't offend the sensitivities of the compilers. That in and of itself gives them value. And so my collection of commonplace books began, which now number at least 50, perhaps 60, maybe 75. And I dip into them randomly each morning as a kind of devotion. I dip into them the way that others might read their Bibles. And so I begin the day looking at 2 or 3 of them, turning to the pages allotted to the day at hand. The readings they contain give me something to mull over during the day, and owing to the very nature of such books and differing tastes of the compilers, I find myself pondering matters that might not otherwise occur to me. In many cases, a reading may be especially relevant to the day at hand. I suppose I would describe this habit of mine as a spiritual discipline, not unlike the practices of those who begin their day with prayer or meditation. In this case, the practice is dependent upon the calendar. That is the organizing genius behind them, since these books are organized around the days of the year. And the regularity with which I open them, like the regularity of the calendar itself, shapes how my days unfold, because it inspires thoughts I might not otherwise consider on the days I read them. Marking time in this way allows me to use it well, I think, between the calendar and the commonplace book, to fill each day with as much activity or inactivity as I choose. It adds order and regulation to my days, and as long as I don't allow myself to become a slave to schedules and routine, it needn't undermine opportunities for spontaneity and change. In the beginning of our days, there is no desire to mark time, and in the end, perhaps there is no reason. At the beginning and the end, time is eternal. But in between beginnings and endings, we mark time almost compulsively. Minutes lead to hours, hours to days, days to months, and months to years, and then we repeat. Calendars are the yardsticks with which we measure the passage of time and organize our lives while the proverbial clock ticks. Please join in our closing hymn, number 143, Not in Vain the Distance Beacons.